In study session 7, Attitudes and Persuasion. In this study session, you will explore the concepts of attitude and persuasion as related to the field of social psychology. You will also examine various ways of making attributions to causes of some behavior. At the end of this study session, you should be able to highlight the component definition of attitudes and functions of attitudes, point out the variables involved in the process of persuasion, and present how attitudes predict behavior. Attitudes. Though there are many possible methods by which attitudes can be defined, attitudes are defined as dispositions to evaluate objects in a negative or positive light. Attitudes include three different elements: affective evaluations, that is, emotions; cognitions, that is, thoughts and knowledge; and actions, which has to do with behaviors. Also, there are many positive methods by which attitude definitions may be classified. One of the most useful is based on consideration of the type and number of components contained in the definition. Single component definition. Several writers restrict the concept of attitude to a single response tendency towards an object, which is always in the evaluative form of positive or negative terms. Collins, 1970, defines attitude as a feeling that an object is good or bad, fair or unfair, while Benn, 1970, states that attitudes are likes and dislikes. They are one's affinities for and one's aversions to situations, objects, persons, and groups. As we shall come to realize later on, most measurement scales adopted the single component definitions of attitude because it is less cumbersome in operationalizing and measuring than other forms. Two component definition. Other definitions of attitude have included cognitive aspects of attitude as the basic foundations in their approach. It is the belief of this school of thought that cognitive components consist of beliefs and thoughts that will facilitate or interfere with evaluation on the attitude object positively or negatively. Three components definition. Other scholars believe that when an expression is held towards the attitude object, then people are influenced either to move towards or away from the attitude object. In other words, there are behavioral dispositions towards the attitude object. Wagner, 1969, states that an attitude is composed of affective, cognitive, or behavioral components that correspond respectively to one's evaluations of, knowledge of, and predisposition to act toward the object of the attitude. Zimbardo and Eberstein, 1970, explain these components as the affective component consisting of a person's evaluation of liking or emotional response to some object or person, the cognitive components consisting of beliefs about or factual knowledge of the object person. From the foregoing, one can say that Depending on the perspective of the researcher, attitude can be defined in its measurable terms, that is, the one that suits the purpose of the researcher. One thing we cannot run away from is the fact that affective component runs through all the definitions, and that this is so because an attitude becomes an attitude only when it is expressed verbally by the individual, and the socially recognizable expression is always in negative or positive terms. Attitudes can be measured with self-reports, Likert scales, with response latencies that capture attitude accessibility, and with attitude linkage measures that gauge attitude centrality. Functions of attitudes. Attitudes serve several functions which include 1. Utilitarian function, where attitudes serve a utilitarian function signaling rewards and punishments. 2. Ego defensive function, where attitudes can serve an ego defensive function protecting people from undesirable beliefs about themselves, for example, the recognition that their lives will inevitably end. 3. Value expressive function. Attitudes serve as a value expressive function, reflecting values that people want others, especially their reference groups, to acknowledge. And 4. Knowledge function, where attitudes serve a knowledge function, organizing how people construe the social world and guiding how people attend to, store, and retrieve information. Persuasion. Persuasion is an active method of influence that attempts to guide people toward the adoption of an attitude, idea, or behavior by rational or emotive means. Persuasion relies on appeals rather than strong pressure or coercion. Variables in persuasion process. Numerous variables have been found to influence the persuasion process, and these are normally presented in 4 major characteristics: who said what, to whom, and how. 1. The communicator, including credibility, expertise, trustworthiness, and attractiveness. 2. The message, including varying degrees of reason, emotion, one-sided or two-sided arguments, and other types of informational content. 3. The audience, including a variety of demographics, personality traits, and preferences. And 4. The channel, including the printed word, radio, television, the internet, or face-to-face interactions. A non-credible source is unlikely to induce immediate attitude change, but with time, the sleeper effect may occur. This is when attitude change occurs after time has passed and the message has become dissociated from its source. Vivid communications, including images of identifiable victims, are usually more effective than more pallid ones, and fear-evoking communications that provide fear-reducing courses of action. Courses of action produce more attitude change than either non-fear-evoking communications or fear-evoking communications that do not provide fear-reducing courses of action. Message content often varies in independent and interdependent societies, with arts in independent cultures, emphasizing the individual, and arts in interdependent societies, emphasizing the collective. The targets or audience of a message also affects whether a particular message is effective and whether attitude change occurs. Audience or receiver characteristics include the need for cognition, that is, how deeply people like to think about issues, mood, and age. According to the third person effect, most people believe that other people are more likely to be influenced by the media than they are. But in fact, the media have surprisingly weak effects on most people. This is true in the case of consumer advertising, political advertising, and public service announcements. The media are most effective in agenda control, that is, in shaping what people think about. They do so through the number of stories and discussions they prevent on various issues like terrorism, moral values, war, the environment, or the economy, and which therefore are likely to be present in people's minds. Models of persuasion. Both the heuristic systematic model of persuasion and the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion hypothesize that there are two routes to persuasion. Factors that determine which route is used include motivation, or how important the message is to the person, and the ability to process the message. When using the central route to persuasion, people attend carefully to the message, and they consider relevant evidence and underlying logic in details. People are especially likely to go through this route when the message is relevant to them, when they have knowledge in the domain, and when the message evokes a sense of personal responsibility. When going through the central route, people are more persuaded by high-quality messages. In the peripheral route to persuasion, that is heuristic, people attend to superficial aspects of the message. They use this route when they have little motivation or time or ability to attend to its deeper meaning. In this route, people are persuaded by source characteristics such as attractiveness and credibility of the communicator, and message characteristics such as how many arguments there are and whether the conclusions are explicit. People can be quite resistant to persuasion because of pre-existing biases, commitments, and knowledge. People selectively attend to and evaluate information in accordance with their original attitudes, tuning in information that supports their pre-existing attitudes and beliefs, and tuning out information that contradicts them. Public commitment to a position helps people to resist persuasion. Just thinking about an attitude object can produce thought polarization or movement toward extreme views that can be hard for a communicator to alter. People with more knowledge are more resistant to persuasion because they are able to counter-argue against messages that take an opposite position to what they know and believe. Resistance to persuasion can be encouraged through attitude inoculation, or exposing a person to weak arguments against the person's position and allowing the person to generate arguments against it. Attitude and behavior. There are many theories that have been discussed extensively to explain the connectivity between an attitude and behavior, whether attitude predicts behavior or behavior has some effects on individuals' attitudes. The section discusses theories explaining the relationship between attitudes and behavior. The theories discussed include theory of reasoned action or planned behavior, cognitive consistency theory, and self-perception theory. The theory of reasoned action and planned behavior. The theory of reasoned action maintains that attitudes guide behavior through a deliberation process that takes into account conscious attitudes toward an object and subjective norms. The theory of planned behavior maintains that the influence of conscious attitudes and subjective norms on behavior depends on people's beliefs that they can perform a given behavior and the behavior will have the desired effects. It can be surprisingly difficult at times to predict behavior from attitudes because attitudes are sometimes ambiguous or inconsistent. Attitudes sometimes conflict with other powerful determinants of behavior. Attitudes are sometimes based on second-hand information about the objects. Attitudes and the attitude targets we actually confront, that is, whether to donate to motherless home or not, may be at different levels of generality and may be about very different things, and some of our behavior is automatic and can be bypassed and can bypass our conscious attitudes altogether. Cognitive consistency theories. Behavior can have very substantial effects on attitudes. Most of the research showing such effects drew out of cognitive consistency theories, which stress how important consistency of attitudes and behavior is to most people. Balance theory. Balance theory was the earliest consistency theory. It specifies that people desire balance among their beliefs and sentiments, and thus prefer to hold attitudes that follow from other attitudes, and prefer to behave in ways that align with their attitudes. Cognitive dissonance theory is based on the idea that people experience dissonance or discomfort when attitudes and behavior are inconsistent. People therefore most often try to reduce the dissonance they are feeling by bringing their attitudes in line with their behavior. People engage in dissonance reduction when making decisions. After making a choice between two objects or courses of action, they find hidden attractions in the chosen alternative and previously undetected flaws in the unchosen alternative. This reduces the dissonance aroused by having to give up some desired object or action. How to reduce dissonance? People also engage in effort justification when they exert effort towards some goal and the goal turns out to be disappointing. They justify their expenditure of energy by deciding that the goal is truly worthwhile. People attempt to reduce dissonance in induced compliance situations, that is, in situations in which other people prompt them to do or say something that is contrary to their beliefs. For example, when induced by another person to argue for a position at variance with their true attitudes, with the promise of some sort of compensation for doing so. People who are undercompensated feel that they must justify their behavior and typically do so by changing their attitudes to better align with their behavior. Dissonance resulting from inconsistency between attitudes and behavior should be felt only when there is free choice to engage in the behavior. There is insufficient justification for the behavior. The behavior has negative consequences either for the self or for another, and the consequences of the behavior were foreseeable. The effects of inconsistency can be reduced if the individual has just had some self-affirming experience that obviates the need to protect the ego from the unpleasant consequences of foreseeable action. Dissonance is apparently universal, but there are cultural differences in the conditions that prompt people to experience it. For example, the Japanese tend to experience post-decision dissonance only when asked to think about how another person would choose. Self-perception theory. This theory originated as an alternative explanation for the results obtained in dissonance experiments. It is based on the premise that people do not move their attitudes into line with their behavior because they are motivated to justify them. They do so merely because they observe their behavior and the circumstances in which it occurs and infer, just as an observer might, what their attitudes must be, given that they behaved as they did. Whereas self-perception may well play a role in generating the effects in many dissonance experiments, some evidence clearly indicates that there is often a motivational component as well. Mere self-perception appears to account for attitude change in situations in which attitudes are weak or unclear to begin with, whereas more motivated dissonance reduction processes are invoked when attitudes are more strongly held to begin with. Study Session Summary. In this study session, it is noted that attitudes have been defined as dispositions to evaluate objects in a negative or positive light. Attitudes include three different elements: affective evaluations, which has to do with emotions; cognitions, which has to do with thoughts and knowledge; and actions, which has to do with behaviors. Attitudes have functions, which include utilitarian function, ego defensive, value expressive, and knowledge function. Persuasion is an active method of influence that attempts to guide people toward the adoption of an attitude, idea, or behavior by rational or emotive means. Finally, models of persuasion were briefly discussed. The study session also discussed theories explaining the relationship between attitudes and behavior. Cognitive dissonance theory is based on the idea that people experience dissonance or discomfort when attitudes and behavior are inconsistent. Self-perception theory argues that people do not move their attitudes into line with their behavior because they are motivated to justify them, but they do so merely because they observe their behavior and the circumstances in which it occurs and infer, just as an observer might, what the attitude must be, given that they behaved as they did. Finally, means of reducing dissonance were discussed with practicable examples. We have now come to the end of Studies Session 7. Thank you for listening.